this topic's gonna be a little. I always say this, don't I? It's gonna be different, but the topic today is going to be Fernando Pessoa. And he is actually one of my favorite poets. And it's particularly because of the way he decides to view the world. And what is really interesting about Fernando Pessoa is that he actually wrote under many names. And he gave them very elaborate biographies. You could say that he lived a life of many selves. Instead of living one life, he chose to live many lives, which is really fascinating. And it's always made me question and wonder, what is the self, whatever the self is, what is it capable of? And I think Fernando Pessoa, he is an example that really pushes those limits. But other than that, that's a somewhat vague introduction about Fernando Pessoa. If you really want to know about him, you can look him up or just read his poetry. But today I'm going to talk about a particular line or a particular part of his poem that really fascinates me. And so here's a couple of the lines from Fernando Pessoa. I believe in the world as in a daisy because I see it, but I don't think about it. Because to think is to not understand. The world wasn't made for us to think about it. To think is to have eyes that aren't well, but to look at it and to be in agreement. I have no philosophy, I have senses. If I speak of nature, it's not because I know what it is, but because I love it. And for that reason, because those who love never know what they love, or why they love, or what love is. To love is eternal innocence, and the only innocence is not to think. Okay, a lot was said here. And what Fernando Pessoa is really capitalizing on is that thinking can distract us. Thinking can distract us from things and what they really are. And the one line that really struck me was, quote, because to think is to not understand. That's really funny. Because, as you know, we always attempt to think in order to understand. I mean, how else would we get to know the world? And this is why I find this line so provocative. Because it would seem to be the case that the only way we've understood what it even means to understand is always in the realm of thinking. And so to understand has always been a sort of thinking concept, or a result of thinking. Well, that, I think, Fernando Pessoa is actually questioning that presupposition. And the real question that he's asking is, what is something that we could understand without thinking? Is it possible to understand something without actually thinking? That's a really good question. And then he's also saying, just because you think doesn't mean you necessarily understand. And just because you think doesn't mean you necessarily know what it is. And that's why I really like when he says, a little bit towards the end of this poem, he says, Because those who love never know what they love, or why they love, or what love is. To love is eternal innocence, and the only innocence is not to think. He's almost equating thinking. He does. He's saying thinking is a loss of innocence. He's provoking a childlike way of living again, I would say. And what is this childlike way of living? Well, we don't know because we're always thinking. But what he is supposing is maybe we should start entertaining what that would be like and what we could understand from not thinking. And sort of just, and he's really advocating for this type of witnessing. And it's interesting because it's very implicit. He's almost saying that the thinking that we know isn't really thinking. That the true thinking, is most likely just perceiving. And thinking as perceiving, or thinking and perceiving as one, would be our innocence. Our true innocence. But of course it's hard to say because the only thinking that we know is the thinking in attempt to understand. So it's almost like Fernando Pessoa is trying to go for this unsaid unity of thinking and perceiving, or perceiving as thinking. But of course, it's really difficult to even think about this because the moment we do, we've lost our innocence. So there is something deeply unsayable here. Because for me to talk about thinking and perceiving and what those are, I'm already thinking them through. I'm already trying to understand what it is being said. And that's also the paradox about even me trying to explain this poem to myself and to you, is that I've already lost my innocence. I already don't understand in my attempt to try to understand. I don't know what it is. I have no idea. And that's what's so provocative about this whole poem, is that you can catch yourself just like this. It leaves you in a kind of awe. And you just don't really know where you are, but you just know that you're somewhere. And you're left with a kind of wonder. And that's what I really love about reading Fernando Pessoa, is that he leaves you like that. You're like, I really don't know what that's like, because I've always been thinking. And I've always been alienating myself with my thinking. And it's always been humorous to me about people trying to understand nature. But it would seem to be the case that the only way to understand nature is to simply just witness nature, instead of thinking what nature is. And then and then somehow, in some way, I don't know, maybe we could actually understand it. At least that's what it seems that Fernando Pessoa is provoking within us. And that's what I really love. But he's really this eternal innocence, that is really striking, right? To love is eternal innocence. Meaning, the moment we think about whatever something is, We've lost it. We've completely lost it. And so the only way to maintain this innocence is to just not think. Which is so antithetical to our society today, our way of living, but it also makes me wonder how much of our self-confliction is actually due to thinking. And how much of our self-confliction is in the attempt of trying to understand. There's a lot of questions that can be provoked out of just this small segment of the poem. And that's why poetry really always has something special to say about life and about things. And what's even more humorous is that in school we're taught about trying to understand the poem rather than trying to understand, or maybe not even try to understand. It's just being awed by the fact that there's something in the poem that moved us. And just being okay with the fact that it moved us. There's something about it that is strictly unsayable. And that's something I wish school would teach people about with poetry. Because poetry becomes really demanding in school. Because you're trying to decipher some secret message. You're trying to decipher, and it gets really boring. You're trying to think the poem. But the thing is, the poem is already the thinking. You just have to be there. You just have to witness the poem. And in many ways, I'm not really sure that people know how to witness a poem anymore. And that's what gets really scary. Because when you could witness a poem, maybe, just maybe, we could actually understand it. And sometimes thinking through the poem would actually make us miss the poem completely. And that's what's really great about poetry, is that really poems are like looking at trees. But the more we examine, the more we actually miss the tree. And that's the paradoxical nature of it. And that's what's really beautiful. And that's also what I really love about poetry. And this is something, of course, everything that I'm saying is what Adam Phillips has said before, is that poetry, maybe we shouldn't try to read poetry in the sense of trying to get it, but looking at poetry in the ways about what is it that strikingly moves us. And I picked this poem specifically because it just moved me. Really, it moved me, and I'm just trying to make sense of it. But of course, in my saying of it, I'm telling you that I really can't. At the end of the day, I'm just saying that it moves me, and that's okay. And somewhere in there, it seems that maybe I actually do understand it, as long as I keep my eternal innocence and try not to think about it. But anyways, I hope that was I'm not sure to say enlightening reflection, but a reflection worth thinking about. Maybe that's a better way to phrase it, a reflection worth thinking about, and having a relook at poetry, and giving ourselves a chance to look at poetry again, and seeing what it might provide, and leaving that unsayable. I think a lot of poetry, paradoxically, should be left unsayable. That we should read it and just let ourselves leave ourselves in innocence of it. And that might be a better way of reading poetry, instead of the more institutionalized way of reading poetry. Just allow ourselves to sink into it and not try to understand it. And perhaps you actually might find it more enjoyable. You might even find it strangely enlightening, and yet not know exactly what that enlightenment is. And overall, that's what's really captivating about it, the whole thing. But I believe I've said enough, because I could talk about this all day, about why I love poetry, and I can never explain it. I can never truly explain it, because as Zizek would say, Slavoj Zizek, he would say, the moment you try to describe what that is, it's not love. It's not. So everything that I have attempted to explain isn't even close to what that love is for poetry. And of course, that's what I love about it. That's what keeps me fully engaged. And I hope that actually might keep you engaged. And it would allow you to maybe keep you engaged into something else, and to look at something else differently, rather than trying to understand it. Alright. Take care, guys.